Hey guys, today I want to look at one of these really interesting setups where you have one side entirely breaking through on the Firzanside, and yet, well, and when I say entirely breaking through, I mean completely penetrating the H file, and yet not being able to make a lot of progress. Yeah, I've talked about these in some of my Mujana lectures, but this is a game that I played today against Bar. As you can see, Barr, as he's been doing lately, tries one of these setups where he's going to make progress on the Firzanside. You can just look, all of the moves are on the Firzanside. You can tell that the whole point of this is to play on the Firzanside. Um, and yeah, and I'd say like this is actually like one of these first serious kind of moments in the game where I could decide to play otherwise. I could start taking space on the Firzanside myself. I could play f4 here, for instance. I mean, h4, I can meet it with g4. f4 isn't such a big weakness because I have knight e2 to defend it, so even if this elephant comes out and it starts tickling this pawn, I can just comfortably sink the knight in on e2. So, I have ways to take space on the Firzanside myself. But did I want to do that? No. Why didn't I want to do that? Well, I wanted to go for the maximum kind of interesting game that I could. So I went for pawn to c4, but I would say don't try this at home. So pawn to c4, basically what I am signaling with this, and what I end up doing after d6, just play knight c3. Black is still bringing his pieces towards the Firzanside, and then I go bonkers. I play rook h2, and I swing the rook over to c2 next. So black plays f5. I just say I don't care, and I bring everything over. And the point of this whole setup is just based on the belief that no matter how much further along Black's attack on the Firzanside is than my attack on the Shah side and in the center, I'm playing in the center and on the Shah side, so my attack will triumph and trump what Black is doing. Now, I don't actually believe that, and I don't think that it's technically true. And you'll see in the game that there were opportunities for Black to do so much better than he did. But this is why I want to show the game, and it's because it's just a good example, and I haven't had a lot of these good examples to show of just what happens if one side plays with absolute confidence that the Firzanside just doesn't matter and can always be held. And so this is what happens. Now, okay, this position, if you get this position in one of your games, yeah, I mean, just play f4. It's fine. You can just continue to play like Mujana stuff, and white is not behind at all. In fact, on the Firzanside, and white has a really good game. And why f4? Well, because if black plays g4, then just h takes, and there's this problem here. So if you hit with f4 and then you put pressure with knight to f3, this is going to force black to kind of compromise his position in some way, like maybe he's going to have to spend a move playing rook to g8. And so here, for instance, if white wants, white can play f takes g. If rook takes, and just here, we're always going to defend these pawns, and this knight comes up comfortably to f3, and white's just getting, some good development. The g3 point is very solid. If f takes this way, actually white is going to be the one to take advantage of the open f file. White is going to have moves like rook f2, maybe at some point knight e4, even coming into f6. So it actually looks like white has everything to play for. Not to mention that at some point, white can maybe figure out a way to develop his pieces and get the other rook doubled on the f file, and that could actually be just very brutal. So um, so pawn to f4, if I had to play this in the quote unquote correct way, I would be playing I'd be playing f4, but that's not what I was going for in this game. And so I played rook to h2, black played f5, and here I went for it. Now you notice immediately, kind of like the first thing that you see is, well, I have deserted the H file. And the fact that I've deserted the H file means that black has a free pass to play G4 here, which he plays and he should play, and that's the right thing to do. Pawn to H4 I don't think is as good. So one approach against pawn to H4 is, white can just play G4 like this. If black takes, then we actually play h takes, and then we can sink the knight into h3, where it blockades everything and it puts pressure on g5. And at some point, white will play e4, elephant to e3, and this g5 pawn is going to be attacked very mightily. So, so f takes g wouldn't be a possibility. Pawn to f4, of course, is a possibility. And here probably white would just meet it with like pawn to e4 like this. Now we really have closed off this entire side of the board. There's complete gridlock here. So I think that white would be better here. White's going to play b4. White maybe plays d4. And white is maybe doesn't have as much space, but he has the pawns on the Shah side up where it matters. So I think white has everything to play for there. Takes is also another way to play, but it seems a bit weird to give up the center. And it's probably not necessary to go down this road. I mean, I think you played takes and something like d4. I don't think black should have any serious problems here, though. Among other things, he might have rook to g8, elephant comes out to h6 to guard this pawn, and then the black rook might come up to g5 and be very active along the fifth rank. So, I'm thinking that that's probably not the way to go, but pawn to e4 is what I would have played. So, okay, so where does that leave us? Well, if pawn to h4 probably isn't the right move, I should also add the other approach against pawn to h4 is to play the Firzanside up here. The idea of takes. This elephant will always hold this pawn on h3. I'm not as huge a fan of this for white here in this position, though, because I think elephant to h6 followed by pawn to f4 at least starts to open up the Firzanside in ways that I wouldn't be entirely comfortable with as white. So h4 I would have met with g4. So besides g4, the other approach is to try for the plan pawn to f4. It might be possible to play it immediately. That would be kind of interesting. That would be an interesting try. There's definitely kind of a pawn sacrifice flair to it this way, but looking at this, okay, black's going to have this elephant coming out, and he has this knight that can come into some really nice squares like d4, h4. My thought is that there's going to be compensation for that pawn. So if pawn to f4, I probably would have to go with a different approach. Maybe Firzanside up would be the approach. The idea of takes, maybe now I would take the time to activate this elephant. Yeah, so Furzan up would be a move, and then of course pawn to e4, that would just run into this, followed by h4, so that's not exactly great. G takes, and then e4, of course, is the other route. And this would be very much in the spirit of kind of my overall plan and kind of how I've been playing this game. Rook to g8. You can play Furzan up, rook to g2, and king to e1. Basically, this would be kind of similar to the game, but there is a key difference here from how things got in the game, which is knight g6, knight h4 puts even more pressure on the f3 square. So I don't know that I would consider this position comfortable for white. So I think probably on f4 I would have gone. Yeah, I think with white you probably should play the Furzan up. So f4 is very interesting. h4 I don't think is great, but g4 is kind of like the logical move and what everybody's intuition would kind of scream out for. And here I just kind of continue with the plan, which was h takes, f4. Of course, it's possible, in g4, it's possible to try to play this and then to play h4. But I'm not really a fan of this because black is going to be the one playing for the e5, elephant h6, and pawn to f4 break, and black's always going to be able to kind of pile up and try to get this break in. And when that happens, it could hit with pretty devastating effect. And g3 is always going to be a weak spot. Knight f6, knight h5 is going to force me to kind of keep this Furzan on a passive square to guard the g3 pawn. But then e5, f4, that whole system would give black like really easy play. So I didn't go that way. So g4 instead, I meet it with takes, and f4. Should be noted, of course, after takes, it is possible to play this way, capturing away from the center. And this would be a little bit different from the game, but I would play f4. Basic idea for white here is going to be to try to achieve a massive center and hopefully just roll black up the board that way. So, of course, black's going to have counterplay with the pawn coming into h4. That stuff could get absolutely crazy, but my thought is that white has pretty decent chances there. H takes is a normal move, and here I went pawn to f4, locking everything up. Rook to h1, f to f2, knight to f6, and then king to e1. So this is the fortress position for white. On the Firzanside side, I'm just saying, okay, do your darndest, try to blow this up. But if you fail and you don't actually crack open this side of the board, then white has the majority here and everything to play for on the Shah side and in the center. Black plays pawn to e5, undoubtedly correct. Just going to develop the elephant and continue to put pressure on f4. f4 is like the critical point that black needs to break. Knight g to e2, yeah, knight on g1 to e2. I'm reinforcing the f4 point, and I'm getting ready to blow the center with e4 or d4. Elephant to e6. And here I go for it. I play pawn to d4. And interestingly enough, though, I think this is kind of where black starts to go wrong. Black opens the center with e takes, and that allows me to play e takes. And black thought probably that he was going to have some good play along the e file, but there are a lot of things that are going to happen between now and when black gets control of the e file. So I'm going to have the d5 push. The f5 pawn is going to become weak. There's always knight d4, knight takes ideas in the air. So I kind of think that maybe black should just go ahead and push. Even though this is what white wants, which is basically to play now with this pawn majority and to hope that this whole side of the board remains locked. But after pawn to e4, okay, you know, what's white play? Probably, so pawn to d5. And yeah, there are going to be different approaches here. One approach might be to go ahead and sack this elephant. Black can then try to reroute the knight maybe this way. Probably see rook b1. If black wants, black can go ahead and play here. It does leave a hole on c6, but both players are going to have a lot of holes here. Knight d4. Maybe knight to c5. You say pawn to a4. The elephant's going to come out this way to hit the knight. Among other things, so maybe knight to b7 here. The idea, okay, elephant comes out. The knight makes its journey over here, all the way to a5, hitting the c pawn. White could continue to just kind of maneuver, but I think, you know, like white's going to be struggling for a way to break through on this side as well. Black has time to go ahead and play king d7, maybe pawn to a6 just to hold the square. This elephant will come out. You know, black will probably throw the other rook on the h-file. White still has a lot that he is going to need to figure out in order to break on this side. And black does have a nice space advantage on the Firzanside. Although, you know, probably more in the spirit of this kind of position would be something a little bit more rough and tumble, like maybe just pawn to c5. The idea being, you know, d takes, sacrifice this elephant. And then here, white would have to try to find a way to break through. Maybe further sacks, so we can keep sacrificing some material here. And the idea is going to be, you know, knight takes, maybe now. Rook to b7 is probably met by rook to b8. But we could see something like check, followed by penetrating to d5, trying to pick up some things here and here. That looks like a decent possibility. It seems to me that white is going to have pretty good compensation here. So, so yeah, so something like pawn to c5 might be like the thematic break. Of course, you know, knight to a5 isn't necessary either. You know, if black wants to prevent all this, he can just play maybe king to d7. And it looks like the black position is pretty solid. Black is going to have the c6 break at his option, although he wants to be very careful before he opens up that side of the board. Overall, it looks fairly balanced, or, you know, and maybe black's doing well. So, yeah, so after e4, so d5 allowing this sack is one possibility. Of course, black doesn't have to take it. There are a million ways to play this position with black. c6 is probably fine, followed by king to c7. That would be like, you know, just a very, very interesting way to play. White's going to have to try to break the whole position open with c5 himself. And then, of course, in terms of other ways white can play, rook to b1 is a move, but ultimately white has to find something to do with this pawn. So white might try something like a4 here, followed by bishop a3 and pawn to c5 himself. So there's a lot of different ways to play this, and I don't actually get the sense that black is any worse. Even though particularly for a blitz game, it kind of feels easier to play with white because everything is on white's side of the board for now. Um, but, understandably, Barr didn't go in for this. He didn't play e4. He didn't want to give me this majority to work with. So he played e takes. But now when the center opens, I kind of feel like I hit my stride. So e takes, black plays c6 because, he wants to get some control over d5. But here I can effectively fight for the center because this knight is on e7. I play elephant to e3. I'm going to chase the knight away, and then I'm going to play pawn to d5. King to d7, this is maybe another turning point. So we see just like a couple of inaccuracies by black, and then suddenly after elephant to g5, knight moves, and then pawn to d5, white really starts to take the initiative in the center, which is exactly what we want with white, right? Because we want to say that the black rook on h1 is totally sidelined, and we want these two rooks to crash through and play against this black king in the center. So instead of king to d7, I think black has to be a lot more cautious. I think pawn to d5 to stop white from playing pawn to d5 would be the way to go. Probably still see elephant coming out, this knight maybe coming here. We might see c takes. Black again just has to be really careful. Knight takes followed by, if we get into this position, this is also looking kind of troublesome for black because the d5 pawn is falling. So maybe black has to kind of keep the tension with c takes d. Yeah, this position also has its share of problems for black, though, because white is going to double on the c file and come through to c7, hopefully. I mean, the idea is black is going to be trying to play for something like knight to e4, but black's king kind of is stuck in the center, and yeah, it feels like white has a good game there. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe d5 was necessary, but it kind of feels like this game is going a bit downhill for black. So now white takes a big edge. Elephant to h6. I mean, it's not going to make sense to do anything with this elephant. If it goes back, then white's just going to have free play in the center, just a chance to double, and maybe blow open the center with c5 against black's king. Yeah, it may be possible to play c5 right away, but I don't know. Probably prep it. If black plays c5 himself, there's always going to be b4. So yeah. So elephant h6. So black is now getting his counterplay going. Remember, he needs to crack through on this f4 point, and he's kind of been missing some moves getting there. But here I think I lose I get a little bit too jumpy. I play d takes. And the problem with this move is that after f takes e6, rook d1, right? I'm just getting ready to pile up on the d6 point. Well, if I ever crack with c5, black is going to push d5. And it's true that, okay, like in the deep end game, this Firzanside is going to come to e5 and I'll get some sort of positional advantage. But in the short term, I still have to worry about black cracking the f4 point, and we're not quite at that magical endgame yet. So actually, it probably would have been better if I just keep the tension. Then I don't know, if king c7 here, for instance, now maybe I can crack with c5. And, you know, like this kind of thing could be pretty ambitious for white. Of course, there's other ways to play too. I mean, maybe there I would play d takes e6, f takes. Maybe there I play knight d4, putting some pressure here and here. Rook e8, rook e2. Yeah, this, yeah, and actually I guess this would transpose back into the game more or less. Yeah, rook d1, if king c7, maybe going this route with c5 would be the way to go to just really try to blow things up. So if d takes, I wonder here. I want to find like some decisive blow. It's not exactly springing to mind. But everything I see here, it looks like black is going to be able to cover it up. So yeah, maybe a bit of an improvement. Play this first. Could be here, king c7. Maybe then I just play rook d2, and I'm threatening to play d takes and crash through on this square on d6. If black goes back, that's a big win for me because there's no longer any threat of sacrificing the elephant on f4 to try to break through. And here I can just kind of take my sweet time. If I want to take this elephant, and, you know, then I want to start walking this guy so like I could take the elephant. I can maybe just walk up. I can hit with c5, force black to play d5, and then maybe I walk this Furzan in. And that's going to be a very, very nice game for white. So, yeah, if rook on c to d2, black would then need to maybe play c5. At this point, though, no, yeah, because at this point I can play takes, and rook takes d6. So that is a big problem. Yeah, so I think the big strength of rook on a to d1 is I'm going to double first, and then I'm going to put pressure on d6, and I'm going to try to force black to have to come back and defend this pawn with something awkward that loses time. As it worked out, if I play d takes first, I don't quite get there because f takes, play rook 81, black plays king c7, and here, you know, rook c to d2. I don't know. Maybe that's probably the right move, but okay. I felt like black plays rook to d8, and I really didn't feel like I'd gained a lot. This is still probably pretty good for white, and bring the Furzan up. And if I bring the Furzan up here, then I might be able, to play c5. If I can get the move c5 in, coax black into playing d5, then I can march the Furzan into e5, and I'll have a really good game. So maybe still that was the right way to play with white. I got a little aggressive, and instead I played knight d4, which worked out really, really well for me in this game. But there was something that I missed. So I'm tickling these two guys, and rook to e8 seems right. I play rook to e2. This is my idea, right? If the Furzan goes back, then I'm able to just exchange and grab the pawn on f5, which is what I want to do. Of course, black plays king d7. And I could just continue with kind of normal moves here, all playing kind of based around the c5 plan. But I did not. Instead, I play rook d3. I'm bringing the rook in for rook left. And it works out perfectly in this game because black didn't find anything better than just taking. So black's attack is now hit. Black has now crashed through on f4, but it doesn't do anything, or it doesn't do enough in time. Now, obviously, I don't want to take, which would allow this knight fork, but I just ignore the pawn that I lost, and I just play rook on d to e3. So now I'm totally breaking through. Black plays knight to e5. but now I was able to take on f4, driving the knight away, and now I was suddenly up material. I have 2 elephants for a pawn, and I'll show you how I went on to win that, although it was not brilliant. So that's how I ended up taking this position and converting it to a material edge, as that black played this, and then my attack in the center came first. So that was the ultimate result. Black started attacking on the Firzanside just early in the game. I played on the Shah side and in the center, and my attack here is just literally coming in 1 move ahead, which was enough for me to win this game. But after rook to d3, black has a really good move that neither of us saw. Black has to hold this position. He has to hold the e6 square and the e8 square. And if he holds this position in the center, then he can play bishop takes f4 whenever he wants and crash through. So the key move is knight to h5. And then after I play rook on d to e3, black plays knight to g7. And white, amazingly, is just out of progress. There is nothing further to do. Maybe you play something like b4, but now black crashes through with elephant takes. And if pawn takes, then just knight takes. And black is now massively better because his attack crashed through and mine didn't manage to crash through at all. Of course, probably pawn takes would be the wrong move here. White would need to just continue to play for something else. I don't know, maybe b5, maybe c5. But there's not a lot of options, and this elephant is now looking like it's going to die because rook h5 is coming, followed by rook takes. And also white's other elephant on f1 is pinned. So this whole position is just kind of a disaster for white. But neither of us saw that, and black came through, but now my attack crashed through. I play takes, so I'm forcing the knight off of e5. Black plays knight to f3. If he just moves it to any old square, then white can play takes, and knight takes, holding this pawn. So this doesn't get black anything. He's now just down a first, basically. The other option, though, so pawn to c5 is kind of interesting, with the idea of c takes, take here with this fork. And of course, the way to combat pawn to c5 would be to move this knight with tempo. The easiest way to do that is just to go ahead and capture. But now black has the opportunity to play knight to f3 check, just like this. So when black plays knight to f3 check, okay, I'm in check here. Looks like my only move is king to d1. This gives black the opportunity to snap off this elephant, and I guess here white plays king to c2. So if we take stock of this position, white has an elephant and a Furzan in exchange for 2 pawns. Black does have some good activity here. This rook at least is kind of playing against the white king. This knight is kind of playing against the white king. The pawn on g4 at some point could make a break for it. White is up a decent amount of material, so I think that probably white's going to be a lot better there. But that probably gave better chances in the game, because after takes, knight and knight to e4 is kind of self-destruct mode. There's probably no reason for black to not just play kind of any normal move, like even just Furzan back or knight to g4 or something. Black ends up just kind of self-destructing and giving up this extra pawn. But he wanted to play d5. I play takes, rook e5. So at this point, if we take stock, black is just down 2 elephants. And I would say that's not necessarily winning for white, except that the white rook position crashing through against the black king seemed to me to be a little stronger, because after rook to c8, coming through here, then I have f5. So I would just go ahead and I hang this elephant here in exchange for the chance to win this Furzan, which is an even better piece. But here I blunder back and give black pretty good drawing chances. I play f takes. As it turns out, I don't end up holding this pawn on e6, so I should just play rook takes. My rook cuts off the black king from stopping this pawn from promoting. And I'll also play rook to e7, so I'll have pretty good play against b7 and a7. Meanwhile, I don't think black gets any good play, so you can play like a rook check. I guess I could play king to e2, but I can just go this way as well. Rook to c3, king just comes to f4. Black can give a lot of checks, but it really doesn't do anything. Rook to d3 or whatever, white can just play here. So black never manages to really crash through or take any material or do anything interesting there. So yeah, f takes was kind of blundering back. Rook takes e6 would have been the way to go. And then after king d6, I play rook e2 because I'm just trying to keep everything defended. But now after check, my king comes up and I ended up just dropping that pawn. At this point, black has really good drawing chances because there's just so few pawns left on the board. You'll see, like, okay, I ended up taking a rook off, and I have an extra elephant in first, but it's not a lot to work with. Particularly rook d3, I'm pinned, so black just continues. Black's goal is to trade off a lot of pawns, and rook plus elephant and Furzan versus rook. We don't actually know which side wins that. The ancient manuscripts, they basically say Suli thought that the stronger side would win that, but that there were other strong players at the time who thought that endgame was drawn. And H.G. Mueller has run some table bases for Shatranj, but unfortunately that endgame was not one of them. So we don't actually know the result, but if black takes off all the pawns and then keeps a pawn, my guess is that he's going to draw. So I think this game probably would have been drawn at this point, except we were not playing with any increment. We were just playing straight up 5 minutes. And this is going to be pretty hard for black to hold, even having a 20-second lead on the clock going into it. So I just very carefully try to take some control of the dark squares. I'm really trying to get a dark square bind. c5 is correct, just stopping all that. King to f4. Okay, I give up. I'm going to try to get my king back in the game this way. d4 is right. fd2. Rook h3 is right. King e4. Black gives some side checks. That looks good. Yeah, elephant to e3 because, well, my plan is to play rook c2 and to gang up on this pawn. But of course, takes, rook g3, rook c2, rook h3. I play a4 check, and here black goes back with king to b6. That's probably not right. I think black can just go ahead and seal the draw by playing king to b4. Rook here takes, and then takes, and king takes a4. Even without this pawn, then this would be drawn. Rook plus furs versus rook is drawn with this pawn. Surely black is drawing now. So yeah, so king to b4, and of course rook to c. If rook to c3, then black just wins with rook takes c3 and king takes. So not that. Yeah, so king to b6 is kind of a blunder. And on that note, probably pawn to a4. Pawn to a4 isn't great, but I think it's the kind of the shot I have. I guess I should play rook to c4 first. If I play rook c4 first and then a4, that transposes back into the game. So a4, king b6, rook c4, rook h1, rook e4. So I'm getting a little bit of play here because I'm going to come in this way. So now I'm starting to have some winning chances again. You know, I mean, is it drawn? Yeah, this is probably still drawn. But I'm slowly starting to regroup. King to c4, black plays over. fd2. So I'm just kind of slowly working my way up. I want to come around and take off the a5 pawn. Here there's an inaccuracy, though, I think. Probably black just should play rook g4 right away. Probably doesn't matter because here he played rook h4 anyway. I'll play king d3. King to d5, though, that probably isn't right. Black ends up deserting the a5 pawn, which gives me good chances. The route to a draw is probably just to play rook to h3. If I play king to c4, just rook to h4 again, so I have to come up with something a little better than that. And play king c2, black plays check, and now, you know, fd2. Now black can just kind of play like the plan. It's the old Philidor's drawing plan, just set rook to h3. Well, yeah, there is one complication though. So rook to b8 followed by rook to b5, and the a5 pawn drops. So black has to be a little bit more careful than that, maybe. So yeah, maybe it has to be king to b6. White would play rook check. Yeah, if king here, then rook here again. That's not very pleasant for black. But then king to a5 doesn't look very pleasant either. We would see rook to b5 there. The c5 pawn is under threat. But then here, I tend to think that there's got to be some way for white to come around on this guy. In fact, it might just be here. I think the plan might be f to c3, rook here, and now maybe we just tuck the king away on a3, like this, so that then we can play fd4. And now there's no rook check followed by c takes. So if the king sits on a3, then white has a way to come around and take this pawn. And if white takes this pawn, then he's going to come around to b6, and then he's going to take the pawn on a5, and that's going to be winning for white. So yeah, so I don't know. Maybe my assessment that this is probably drawn is premature. Maybe that's not the right assessment here. Maybe this is actually winning for white, which would make sense because these pawns are on dark squares and they can be captured by this extra Ferzan. Yeah, so rook h6. But here, yeah, rook h4, king d3. Yeah, I went back. I probably don't have to. King to e4. I threw in some checks and then grabbed at the pawn on a5, and here black ran out of time. So yeah, so what are we left with then in terms of black trying to draw? Well, rook to h2 check, king here. You know, c4, this kind of move probably doesn't work because here, and then just rook check and grab. So yeah, so this endgame, honestly, this endgame is very hard for black to hold because of some subtle maneuvering that white can do. There definitely was a chance, kind of in the time scramble. Here, king to b4 would have been a draw. That would have drawn with some conviction. But if I'd played rook to c4 first and then a4, then it would have ended up more or less like the game. And because white has this plan of getting his rook to b5, putting pressure here, and focusing in on these two pawns, I tend to think that white ought to be able to win that. So I guess that's my conclusion. Okay, so what did we learn from this game? Well, I would say when black comes out on the Firzanside like this, there's no reason to play this rook maneuver that I did, playing for kind of a pure Sayyal. It's, kind of like, don't try this at home. I wanted to try it. I wanted to see how it would go. It worked for me in this game, but I had some close calls. So if I got this again, I would just play f4 like a normal person. Um, playing this here, g4, I think it would have been really interesting to see what would happen on this f4 break. That would have been a totally different game. It could have even been prepped with like bishop h6 or something, or even pawn to e5. It could have been prepped. So that would have been very interesting to see. G4 was just kind of like the normal reaction. And I set up my fortress. E4, like, this is interesting stuff. This is kind of unexplored territory. My sense is that maybe in practical terms it might be a little difficult to play for black, just because white now has the options on the Shah side. But I don't know that objectively black should be any better, or black should be any worse. But taking kind of gave me a free hand, particularly when I got this elephant here. Things looked really good for me. I should have probably just kept the tension in the center, and it looked like it was just going to be this perfect, like, great game breaking through in the center, faster than black crashed through on the Firzanside. That's certainly how I felt after I played the game. But yeah, neither of us realized that after rook d3 there was here, followed by bishop takes f4, and black is much, much better there. So that's why I would say I wouldn't repeat this strategy for white. That's why I say don't try this at home. But it did work for me in this game in pretty good style. All right, thank you guys for watching. See you next time.